Say this is a meeting about a meeting. So should we expect a major headline out of these talks between the Russians and the Americans in Riyadh today?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me. I think that, yes, you're right. This is a meeting about a meeting, and so much of the contours of these discussions are going to be really important to the end game. So even if there isn't a glaring headline out of the talks today, they will be very significant for the long term. And then additionally, of course, U.S. President Donald Trump really likes to govern by the headline. And he may very well generate his own headlines come the morning in the U.S. with his spin on this that provide even more context and perhaps are more bombastic than anything that we see out of the discussions themselves.
So, Max, the pressure is really on to strike a deal here. On the one hand, the talks today are aimed at laying the groundwork for what could be a Trump-Putin summit in Riyadh to essentially push forward a Ukraine ceasefire deal. But they also need a deal here that stops Russia's war without handing victory to Moscow, a deal that does not weaken Ukraine, and a deal that doesn't shatter NATO unity in the process. I think it's fair to say that Europe is at a pretty significant moment of crisis right now. Would you agree? And what will this deal eventually look like for Ukraine?
I think this is a fundamental crisis around the future of Europe's identity, security structure, political structure, and geopolitical and even economic relationships with the world. The point that you raised about this being a crisis and that some of the quotes that you included from Scholz and the Polish Prime Minister earlier are particularly important because one thing that I think has been lost in some of the discussion that we have seen is that for Vladimir Putin, breaking and shattering the U.S.-European alliance is even more important than getting the dividing line the next 10, 20, 30, even 150, 200 kilometers west. We know he wants to get it quite a bit more significantly west. We see comments from the Russian officials talking about the annexation of the entire Kherson, Zaporozhye regions, despite Russian withdrawals from those areas after the Ukrainian pushback 2 years ago now, and even longer than that. So, the context of this is really important for that European future. Of course, for Ukraine, it is critical. I would say I do think there has been some hysteric reaction to all of this. Trump has a very bombastic style. I do not think Trump would himself be willing to agree something that sees Russian troops roll back into Kiev or even Kharkiv, just 30 kilometers from the dividing line now. That's Ukraine's second largest city in the east, because Vladimir Putin wants that kind of victory, but Trump knows that if he gives that to him, that's an indelible blot on his time in governance. This is a scenario, however, where Europeans, Ukrainians, and others have to be thinking about the precedent we saw from Afghanistan, where Donald Trump, in the last year of his first term in office, agreed a deal that essentially gave the Taliban the ability to reassert full control of the country. That was, of course, only actualized after Trump was no longer in precedent. So it won't just be the security guarantees that matter now for 2025 and 2026 if there is a peace deal, but also getting that European defense industry in line, getting a credible U.S. deterrent, as British Prime Minister Keir Starmer was saying yesterday, and ensuring that what happens on January 21st, 2029 isn't similar to what we saw on the 24th of February, 2022.
Talk to me about that U.S. deterrent and how far the Americans are willing to go here, because it would seem here that Trump has already said Ukraine won't join NATO. He said there's going to be no American boots on the ground, and he has also acknowledged some of these Russian territorial gains that have been made at least since 2014. You mentioned the UK leader, Keir Starmer, wants a US security guarantee. That's something that the Europeans would also likely want to get alongside with as well. But what is the appetite stateside to actually provide that backstop?
Sure. I don't think that the Trump administration has the appetite to provide that clear backstop. We saw Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, rule it out. But Starmer's point as to why this is so critical, I will draw back on a comparison from one of the other great European crises after the Berlin airlift, the Soviet blockade of West Berlin, and the agreements around defense structures there. One of the most famous theoreticians of deterrence was a man named Thomas Schelling. And he was asked once, what can a few hundred American soldiers in West Berlin do? in the face of the Soviet army that surrounds them. Just as what could a few American brigades or European brigades do today in Ukraine in the future? And Schelling's answer was very bleak, but got to the point of it very quickly. He said, put simply, they can die, and then Americans have to care about it, and then that deterrent is credible. Now, that is the same kind of logic that we see going on here, but even more importantly is the nuclear deterrent behind it. The U.S. having that nuclear deterrent. Yes, the United Kingdom and France have that nuclear deterrent as well, but they would need to really put that in a way that I think would not be realistic under their political environments to put that forward. And then without the kind of troop commitment behind it, that deterrent becomes very weak. So either the two solutions are put Americans there for that reason, which there are many Americans who support and there are many Republicans who support, but I don't think Donald Trump does, or for Europe to find a way to have its own nuclear umbrella. And as much as I'm an eternal optimist, that is not an outcome that I consider likely.
Max, just quickly, what's going to happen after this US-Russia meeting in Saudi Arabia today?
Sure. I think it may be rather quickly that we see a meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Remember, Trump's first visit abroad in his first term was also to Saudi Arabia. He also has particular goals that he wants to achieve in relations with Israel and Saudi Arabia, potential normalization there. So maybe some kind of dual trip there. Again, Trump wants to govern by headline and would love to be able to tout some kind of early success there. I don't think, however, even if we saw that kind of summit, that would mean that there would be a ceasefire immediately. I think, my outlook for that in a best case scenario, which is probably not the one I'm based on, would be midsummer.